Wow, thanks, Sam. Will Hall is next. Do you want to?
Kalimera, kalimera. Kalimera. Ευχαριστώ πολύ που με καλέσατε να μιλήσω. Είναι τιμή μου να είμαι εδώ. Δεν μιλώ ελληνικά. I'm sorry, that's the only Greek that I know, I'm afraid. Actually, that's not true. I do know a phrase. I know nostimo, polynostimo, which is very, very useful in Greek because you have such delicious food here, yeah. Well, thank you very much. Do people want to take like a very quick stand up and stretch a little bit? Yeah, just if you want to stretch just real quick. I'm going to make my talk fairly concise, so yeah, just stretch a little bit. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. And since this is a talk about suicidal feelings, can you hear me? No, you can't hear me. Better. Better? 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 Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And since this is a talk about suicidal feelings and social justice, I thought I would start with a joke. It's actually a true story, and it's a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, who became very suicidal and wanted to die. She wanted to end her life. So she called the suicide hotline, and she was put on hold. And she said to me, those 40 minutes of hold music saved my life. So that, I think, is one of the biggest messages of understanding suicidal feelings, is that suicide is a mystery. Suicide is a mystery. When someone takes their own life, we cannot simply say we know the cause of why that happened. Some people talk about it before they take their lives. A lot of people don't talk about it at all. So when someone does speak with us about their suicidal feelings, it's a very important moment. It's a very important response that we have to give them. It's a very, very crucial opportunity to connect with them, because a lot of people don't talk about suicidal feelings. And so we have to see that as a positive thing. Talking about suicidal feelings is a positive thing. So when I was contacted a couple of nights ago by a client who was in crisis and was suicidal, I was happy that she called me. And we talked, and she explained that she was very scared. She felt very unsafe, that she was making preparations, that she had made preparations for her cats, her 3 cats, who she loves. She had made preparations to give them to a friend to take care of them when she was gone. So at this moment, I, of course, am a little afraid. I'm concerned for her. I could start doing what professionals do, which is that they start to do an assessment, a suicide assessment, because she has one of the risk factors. And it turns out that if you talk with her, she has many risk factors. In fact, she's been in the system before, and she kind of knows what these risk factors are, and she kind of frames her own experience in terms of her own internalized assessment. So the question is, what about these assessments that everybody is doing? And actually, I did a little bit of research. I took a look at this question of, is it possible, if you do an assessment of someone, if you interview them, if you find out, if you look at all the risk factors, if you look at all the different ingredients that go into their life, is it possible to predict whether or not they will kill themselves? The answer is very clear. There's an entire discipline of study of suicide called suicidology. In fact, there's research done by the U.S. Army. They're very interested in understanding about suicide and being able to say, this person is going to attempt suicide, this person is not going to attempt suicide. The U.S. Army has a big issue with suicidal feelings, big issue with suicides, and so they're very interested in this question: can clinicians predict whether someone will commit suicide or not? And the answer is very unequivocally no. There is no way to predict whether one person will commit suicide and the other person will not, even if you have all the risk factors, even if you have all the information before you. So what are these assessments about then? Well, what an assessment basically is, an assessment for suicide risk, is you're assessing how afraid the clinician feels that you will kill yourself, and how afraid the clinician feels that they will be blamed. And you're assessing how afraid the clinician feels that someone who's in a position of authority over them will hold them responsible. That's what suicide assessments are about. They don't have a clinical validity in terms of predicting suicide. What they do is that they express the fears that institutional authorities have over being held responsible, accountable, being held liable for being blamed. And the reality is when someone dies, everyone starts blaming everybody. And that doesn't mean that we have solutions about what caused a suicide or what led one person to kill themselves and what led another person not to. It just means that there's a lot of interest in blaming. So that's really what suicide assessment is about. And one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about talking about suicidal feelings and talking about suicide assessment, suicide risk assessment, and having people look at the research that doesn't support that you can predict who's going to commit suicide and who's not. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about this is because saying that someone is at risk of suicide is one of the number one reasons people are forced into psychiatric hospitalization. It's the number one rationale for violence being committed on a person in the name of protecting them and their safety. So if we are serious about social justice, if we're serious about human rights, if we're serious about preventing people from being harmed by the psychiatric system, if we're serious about preventing the trauma that is caused by the psychiatric system, then we need to question this issue of suicide assessment, and we need to look at what happens at that moment when you tell a professional that you have suicidal feelings. We need to take a very close look at that, because that's the rationale. That's what the professionals say. They say, well, you're at a risk for suicide. We think you're going to commit suicide. And so, well, you know, it may be unpleasant to be in the hospital, but actually it's safer than dying. Well, that is clinician predicting the future based on some faulty assessment instrument. It's not based in reality, and it's an expression of that clinician's fear. So we need to be very clear about this. And if we're going to challenge forced treatment, I think we really need to talk more openly about suicidal feelings. So take a look at the research. There's research that's been done by the U.S. Army about this, saying that, you know, you cannot predict based on all the different risk factors. Now, what happens is that before you ever are forced into a hospital, before you are ever forced into treatment, and someone asks you, are you feeling suicidal? You will say, absolutely, yes. You want help. You want someone to listen to you. You're concerned that you want to get some services, and so you'll say, yes, I am suicidal. And that's probably the last time you're going to be open about your suicidal things, because what will happen often is that that's when you will be locked up against your will. That's when force will happen. Now, I should say, I'm not always against hospitalization. I know that there are people who have felt safe being in hospitals. In fact, I've supported people going voluntarily into the hospital. I do also know some people who have been hospitalized forcibly, and they're grateful for that. They feel good about that. But the reality is that the risk is too great. There are too many people who get traumatized, who get hurt, who get seriously damaged by forced psychiatric hospitalization, and who then, as a result, learn to not talk about their suicidal feelings. People learn to not talk about suicidal feelings as a result of the treatment response that they get. Now, think about that. That is absolutely backwards. We should be encouraging people to talk about their suicidal feelings. We should be encouraging people to connect with professionals, to connect with their communities, to connect with support groups, family members, and to talk openly about their feelings, because we want everybody to talk about their distress. We don't want people to be alone. So what we're doing instead is that the second time you encounter the psychiatric system, you learn that you better not talk about your suicidal feelings, or else they're going to take away your liberties. And this is a very serious human rights issue. People have their civil liberties denied. They have their basic human rights violated. So our standard of care for suicidal feelings is risk assessment forced intervention, and that is resulting in people being less free to talk about their suicidal feelings. The whole situation is backwards. There isn't research about this, but I believe that if you're teaching people to not talk about their suicidal feelings, that's actually going to result in more suicides. I think that our treatment system is absolutely backwards, and it's causing more suicides than it's actually preventing. So if you start to look at the question of suicidal feelings, it's very interesting because there are some parallels with the experience of hearing voices. And the parallel is that actually it's normal to have suicidal feelings. It's normal to have suicidal feelings. That suicidal feelings are much more common in the culture than we acknowledge. There is a myth that if you are feeling suicidal, it is a symptom of a depressive illness that needs treatment through medications. This is a marketing myth from the pharmaceutical companies. Actually, suicidal feelings are quite common and quite widespread in society. It does not necessarily mean that it is the sign, a symptom of some depression. It could be something else that's going on. And certainly there's no evidence or research that suicidal feelings are the symptom of a disease process. And so just as we respond to voices with listening and not judging, but listening and exploring, this is exactly what we need to do with suicidal feelings. Now, I think there's a lot of different understandings of suicidal feelings. I don't want to put things in one box, but my experience is that actually this idea that when we feel suicidal, we're giving up on life, I don't believe that that's actually true. I think that when people give up on life, they wake up in the morning, they make breakfast for their kids, they go to work, they come back, they watch TV, they go to sleep, they wake up in the morning, they go to work. Giving up on life is actually pretty normal. That's actually what most people experience, is a lot of giving up on life. I think that actually suicidal feelings are a message, just like we have a message in voices. And that's why it's very important to not necessarily go against the message. What I tend to see in the people that I work with and in my own experience is that actually suicidal feelings are not giving up on life. Suicidal feelings is a desperate need for changing life. It's a desperate need for changing life. And that passion, that intensity, that I've got to make this change. I absolutely have to make this change, or else my life isn't worth living. That is combined with a feeling of total powerlessness to make the change possible. So what I see is that suicidal feelings tend to be a combination of a desperate need for change with a feeling of utter powerlessness to make that change possible. And so I encourage you, when you think about these feelings in yourself and other people, to maybe explore that as a framework. Because if the change that you need is so important, it's so important that you're willing to die rather than give up that change. Isn't it really important to find out what that change is all about and to work with the person? And this explains why, if someone has suicidal feelings, if you try and tell them why life is worth living and they have all these things to go for and they shouldn't kill themselves, why that often backfires. Because you're denying them the truth and the validity and the importance of that message of the change that they really want to make. If you're telling them, look, your life is worth living, don't be suicidal, you're basically saying to them, don't listen to the message of change. And that message of change is really, really important. Really, really important. Often it doesn't take very much just to have the message get surfaced and talked about and say, look, let's work on this. Whatever the changes that you need to make in your life situation, your relationship, and the amount of physical pain that you're in, that you don't have meaning in schooling and career, economics. Let's see what kind of change we can work on. Let's see what kind of hope we can develop for making that change. Now, the larger frame of this is, of course, that all human experience is meaningful. And that is really, really vital, because when people become suicidal, not only is that message meaningful for themselves, but it's meaningful for the collective. We know from research that the rates of suicide go up when there's economic crisis, when there's situations of oppression, when there's global imperialism coming down on your country, like is happening in Greece. Suicide rates increase. So the message of change can potentially collectively feed into a message of social justice and working together collectively for change. Now, I should say that in addition to working with a lot of people and working in support groups and peer groups and working as a therapist, I also myself live with suicidal feelings. I sometimes go through periods where I want to die. And I should say that I'm not going to kill myself. I very much believe in being alive. I'm not going to take my own life. But I do sometimes have very, very difficult, very, very painful suicidal feelings. So, I don't want to die, but so if you do read that Will Hall was found dead by a suicide, this was not me, this was the CIA, did this to make it look like a suicide. So, I guess, is that paranoid? I guess I live with paranoid feelings too. That's also another normal experience. A lot of the research shows that paranoia is actually a normal experience. There are actually cultures around the world that are based on paranoia, where suspicion and thinking that there are people plotting against you is the normative way that people are interacting in those indigenous societies or those cultures. So I live with these experiences of suicidal feelings. I'm grateful for them because it's a passion for change, and I try and get behind it, and I try and get into a sense of that I do have hope for making that change, that I'm not powerless, that I can get some power back, and I can make some of those changes. The number one way to not feel powerless is to not be alone. That's the number one way. That's why it's so vital when we do our support groups, with the Hearing Voices movement, we do our support groups at the Freedom Center and in the United States, and the whole history of the peer support movement. It's so vital that we welcome people to talk about their suicidal feelings, that we have that confidentiality, that they're not going to be reported or mandatory disclose that they need to go to the hospital or the authorities are going to come in. Because to find power, to make change, we have to overcome our isolation. So I wanted to just wrap up with a poem by one of America's great poets, Marilyn Monroe. She was also an actress. You may know about her. And she struggled with suicidal feelings. I don't believe that she committed suicide. I believe that she was killed, but that's a whole other workshop. So, but this is a poem, Marilyn Monroe. Oh, damn. I wish that I were dead, absolutely non-existent, gone away from here, from everywhere. But how would I do it? There's always bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge. No, not the Brooklyn Bridge, but I love that bridge. Everything is beautiful from there, and the air is so clean. Walking it seems peaceful there, even with all those cars going crazy underneath. So it would have to be some other bridge, an ugly one with no view. Except I like in particular all bridges. There's something about them. And besides, I've never seen an ugly bridge. So I hope from hearing that poem from Marilyn Monroe, you'll understand why I don't believe that she wanted to die, why I believe that she wanted to change. Thank you.